Welcome back, everyone. Suitably refortified and refreshed by the coffee break. And now to this second dedicated panel discussion. And I'm delighted to be joined here by old friends and new friends. We'll be focusing, as per the programme, on big regional players, the role of external actors in the region, competing agendas, and also exploring perhaps where there might be arguably some dovetailing agendas. I would just echo the thanks expressed by others already, really, to the organisers, Dennis Samet, for putting together this excellent conference, and also our hosts at St Anthony's. And if I may, because there's been a late change in the panel lineup, and delighted that Armenak Madjian has joined us. Sadly, Richard Girgasian was taken ill on his journey here, and I'm sure you would all join in wishing Richard a very full and good recovery. If I may, just three very brief comments, two bilateral and one multilateral, as we then go into the different interventions by colleagues on the panel. But I suppose when one looks at the 3+3 in the region, and I know it's well familiar to an audience like this, but it is one of the anomalies when you look at the three South Caucasus and the three regional players, that the only one that has full diplomatic relations with the other five is, of course, Iran. And I think that is both a sad statement, partly reflecting back to what Georgi Khalashvili was saying when you look at the last 10 years and things that haven't changed. I think, as ever, the paradox is stuck situations, but also fluid beneath the surface. The second bilateral point is, of course, I would argue one thing that has really changed in the last 10 years has been really the diminishing role of the US, or the US's profile in the region. And I'm sure one thing that could come out in the discussion, hopefully later, is different perspectives on the John Bolton visit, the dash around the region recently, and I think it would be fascinating to get some perspectives and take on that. But the multilateral one is, however you list multilaterals, whether that's NATO, EU, OSCE, Council of Europe, the basic fact is, as we were hearing right at the outset, that there's three multilaterals, of course, which each of the states in the South Caucasus are full and sovereign members of. But with NATO and EU and their different perspectives in the region, the issue that we always come back to, and not least with the EU, is the membership perspective. And I think it would be very interesting, again, in the discussion today, to hear how realistic, looking at the medium to longer term, where that membership perspective lies. But without further ado, and I think we'll take the batting order, if that's okay, as on your list, I'll hand the floor directly to Amanda Paul.
Thank you very much, Craig. Hello, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank very much Links, my old friend Dennis Samut, and the Russian and Eurasian Studies Centre for inviting me here to speak today. It's really a pleasure to be here at Oxford University. I'm going to touch on Turkey's role in the region. I'm going to look at it as sort of from the beginning, so to speak, not to give everybody a history lesson, but to understand where Turkey has come from in the relationships that it has now. You need to look a bit at where it started from. I mean, first of all, for Turkey, stability in the South Caucasus, is of crucial importance. But up until the end of the Soviet Union, I mean, Turkey was pretty much frozen out of the region. But that said, as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, Turkey was one of the first to recognize the newly independent states. And not only that, Turkey at that time pushed very hard for their integration into Western institutions, including the Council of Europe, NATO, to have ties with the EU, because Turkey viewed that as being part of the West could help guarantee stability in this part of the world, but also reduce the influence of Russia there. And of course, at that time, Turkey itself was very much anchored to the West. So in fact, this decision, made sense for Turkey, because it was sort of, aligning the region with itself and then with Turkey's traditional allies in the West. I mean, Turkey also wanted to gain a presence itself in the region, to develop economic and trade links, and to try and balance, of course, the roles of Russia and Iran, but without provoking them. I mean, for those of you that know Turkish history, there's always been, let's say, difficult or unpredictable relations, to say the least, between these two superpowers and Turkey. And at the same time, Turkey also had an ambition to be an energy and transport hub. So apart from promoting the integration with the West, Turkey also promoted regional platforms, for example, the BISEC platform, which brought these three countries together. At the same time, Turkey, let's say, prioritized stability over democratic reform in the region. You could say a more of a pragmatic approach. And if we look back to the time of the Rose Revolution, Turkey was extremely, concerned that the Rose Revolution could actually spill over into some sort of instability into Turkey. So Turkey wasn't, let's say, vocally supportive, so to speak, as some other countries were. In terms of the conflicts in the region, I would say that in the early days, Turkey had, they tried to play quite a useful role vis-a-vis the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, but this was, quite short-lived, because obviously when Armenia took Kalbajar region, Turkey's position totally shifted, and Turkey has since then more or less fully supported the position of Azerbaijan. Turkey's never had a role in the conflicts in Georgia. Now, if we look thereafter in terms of the regional integration of Turkey with these countries, you could say in the early 90s, when you had the new leaderships that came to Baku and Tbilisi, Turkey began to develop ties with both of these countries. They saw it as a way to facilitate stability and also build regional cooperation. And this began back in the day with the US-backed Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, then the Erzurum oil or gas pipeline, and many years down the road now, we've seen this year the inauguration of the TANAP gas pipeline, which is part of the southern gas corridor. There's also transport projects such as the Kars-Tbilisi railroad, and Turkey has developed very close trade relations with both countries. And beyond trade, there's also military and defense cooperation. You now have high-level trilateral meetings between Azerbaijan, Turkey and Georgia. And if we look at trade turnover, in 2017, the trade turnover between Georgia and Turkey was 1.58 billion. And with Azerbaijan, it was 2.64 billion. And Turkey's also been a strong supporter of Georgia's accession to NATO. I mean, even at this last summit this year in Brussels, it was the Turkish foreign minister was actually one of the few voices there that was still calling for Georgia to be in NATO, despite all of the, let's say, stability that's been going on in the Black Sea. But clearly, the most special relationship that exists is that between Turkey and Azerbaijan. They have a military alliance. But that said, I think it's highly unlikely that Turkey would ever go into a war situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. And in this respect, I mean, Turkey's ability to play a larger role in the Caucasus has been held back due to its relations with Armenia, non-relations. But that said, when we go back to the beginning of the period of the AKP leadership, when they came into power a few years later, as you all may remember, there was the famous, Davutoglu zero problems with neighbours foreign policy, which led to this process to normalise ties with Armenia, starting off with this famous football diplomacy in 2008. But unfortunately, I mean, this process failed, as we both know. I mean, the fault I would consider lies on both sides. I mean, from the point from the Turkish perspective, I think Turkey underestimated the response of Azerbaijan, how much the Azerbaijanis would be opposed to it. But I also think it was a result of a lack of buy-in as well from Turkish society, because it was a very, let's say, closed process in terms of the people that were actually driving it. It wasn't owned by society. So I think this also contributed. But still, good work goes on today between civil society in both Armenia and Turkey, which is very useful in terms of reconciliation and building, people-to-people contacts. I personally believe the chances of a new process between Armenia and Turkey are at the present time very unlikely. The Turkish government or the Turkish president, they have different priorities. The agenda has become much more nationalistic, and also the fact that Turkey's relationship with the EU is now derailed. Turkey's become a far more unpredictable country with a new government system where more or less one man decides, and also the fact that Turkish foreign policy today is far less aligned with EU foreign policy than it was, let's say, 15 years ago. So you don't have this element. Now, when it comes to Russia, because I just want to say a few words about how Russia and Turkey interact in this region. I mean, Turkey's relationship with Russia has historically been very volatile, let's say. They've fought many wars. The Russians have won most of them. And Turkey has never trusted Russia. But Turkey recognised, that Russia is still the dominant power in this region. And I do think that Turkey has broadly tried to avoid any direct confrontation with Moscow while it's tried to deepen its ties with Azerbaijan and Georgia. But I mean, there have been some incidents in the last few years which have put Turkey in a very difficult situation within this balancing of relations. I mean, the first thing was obviously the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia. Turkey didn't take sides, which obviously disappointed the Georgians. So they tried to have a balance between the West and Russia. And Turkey promoted at that time what it called a Caucasus Stability and Cooperation Pact, which as a sort of process to bring all the parties together. I mean, ultimately, this didn't go anywhere, but Turkey went to Moscow to try and promote it. Back then, Turkey didn't allow some extra US ships into the Black Sea. It stuck exactly to the word of the Montreal Convention. And I think, again, this showed that Turkey distrusted the West and doubted the US's commitment in the Black Sea and feared that it could be left alone to fend off the Russians if something happened at that time when it was a particularly volatile period in the Black Sea region. And this approach of Turkey, I think, unsettled the allies in the West. And again, Russia's subsequent increase of its military presence in Georgia's occupied territories, this also concerned Turkey because it was another step towards possibly creating more regional instability. Now, this situation was further exacerbated in 2014 when the Russians annexed Crimea and then again began to immediately militarize the peninsula and then the Black Sea region. This heightened the security concerns in the South Caucasus, and actually it left Turkey in a really uncomfortable position because nowadays Turkey finds itself completely encircled by the Russians, from the Black Sea to the military bases of Russia in Georgia and Armenia, and now, of course, the Russian military base and activity in Syria. I mean, Russia has become an Eastern Mediterranean player. I mean, this was a dream of the Russians to have like a warm water port down there. But I mean, for Turkey, this was really a disastrous situation. It felt very vulnerable. And as we know, worst was still to come. And of course, this followed Turkey shooting down the Russian jet in November 2005, because after that, we have basically seen the Russians crush Turkey. I mean, they used every single tool in their box, trade, economic ties, everything, stopping Turkish construction workers going to Russia. They did everything to punish Turkey for this act. And something happened then, which never normally happens in Turkey nowadays. President Erdogan eventually had to apologize to President Putin and to allow this relationship to go back to some sort of normal, if you can call that relationship ever normal basis, and of course allow Turkey, which was crucial at that time, entry into the Syrian theatre because, among other things, Russia had blocked that. So we talk about now Turkey and Russia having normalized ties and they're cooperating in different formats, including in Syria. and at the highest level. But I mean, I honestly think that nobody should be fooled into thinking that this relationship is anything more than a relationship of convenience. And of course, this also happens when Turkey has very difficult ties with the United States, with the West more generally, and with the EU. And Russia is able to exploit this. But again, we can't say how long this good relationship is going to last, because throughout history, relations have been good, and then they've been bad, and then they've been good again. And just very shortly, because I know I've probably run over my time, when we look, at Turkey today, I mean, Turkey has undergone a dramatic, in my opinion, strategic reorientation. It's moved from a role within a larger multilateral alliance towards more unilateral assertions. Turkey is not the country that it was in the 1990s or the 2000s. I mean, this leadership in Turkey has taken on a very different road. And I have to say, while we can point the finger of, blame to some of the leadership in Turkey, I mean, I do believe as well the EU has had a role to play in this reorientation, which of course is linked to the undermining of Turkey's accession process, putting unnecessary obstacles, which has helped to also sort of undermine democracy. It wasn't very helpful, and I think this has played a role in reducing the ability of the EU and Turkey to cooperate in different places around the region where they might have, let's say, a lot of common challenges, which I think is detrimental to regional security. Turkey is far more focused nowadays on being a regional power than on its historical ties with the West. And as I mentioned, working in this multilateral framework, Turkey puts its national interests first. And just as a very last word, although I do think that the cooperation that Turkey has created in the South Caucasus with Azerbaijan and Georgia, I think it's positive. Generally, I do think it's positive because it's brought positive benefits for all three countries. But I do think there's also another flip side of this coin, because in some occasions, Turkey has used its leverage there in a negative way. I think that Georgia's dependence, for example, on Turkey has exposed it to Turkish pressure. I mean, one of the examples of this was the pressure that Georgia came under regarding the closing down of the Gulen movement schools that were in the country, and pressure to expel some individuals who were associated with the Gulen movement. I mean, it's something that Turkey has been doing broadly in the region. This chap called, Mr. Chabuk. And I do think this put Georgia in a difficult position, because it was left between, the human rights obligations that it has as being an associate member of the EU, and the economic pressure from Turkey, which is rather uncomfortable. So while I do think Turkey has, broadly speaking, does actually play a positive role in terms of regional cooperation to a certain degree, I do think that this new Turkey also has the capability of sometimes using this newfound regional hegemonic role, if you want to say that, in a negative way as well, which I don't think is very, very, very credible. So I'm sorry if I overran.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for that very cohesive and nuanced presentation, and I think not least reminding us of the securitization and militarization in the region. If we could move on directly now to Giorgio, who'll be focusing on the EU role.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So, usually much of my research is related to, let's say, the economic trends and the nitty-gritty of governance in some contested territories in this area. But today we'll be talking about broader issues, and since part of our previous speakers have already dealt with some of the ways in which the European Union interacts with this region, I'll open, let's say, the discussion for some of the big dilemmas that the European Union faces in the South Caucasus. So one of the dilemmas is obviously that one about should it approach the South Caucasus as a region or as a sum of bilateral relationships, for example. Another big dilemma that the EU constantly faces is how much to, let's say, politicize its presence there. So for example, if it should support the understanding that an association agreement is some sort of civilizational choice, or if instead it should try to depict it as more technical, administrative almost document that just like, it just sets some standards and so forth. And it's always like, difficult to find the right balance. And we've seen that, happening in Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia, for example, like different degrees, like finding the right balance between like politicizing and getting some like political support for this kind of cooperation, and rather like just get document through and start like working from the bottom up, from getting closer the administrative and bureaucratic even structures of the respective country and the European Union. So the question I will focus on in this brief talk is the issue of conflict. So like one of the big dilemmas that the EU faces is how much to talk about conflict. And the question I will be asking is, should the EU talk more or less about conflict when it works in the region? Or should it think more about conflict but talk less about conflict? And is it really possible to decouple the thinking and the talking while building trust with all involved? So I'll start from the following tentative answer and then explain what I mean by it. So tentative answer goes like that the EU should talk more about conflict when focusing on issues that are not directly related to conflict. And the EU should talk less about conflict when we focus on conflict themselves. And I explain what I mean, and of course, like all of these is to some extent like part of the EU, let's say, activity in the region, and a lot of it is about like just nuance. So all of these things are happening to different degrees. So when I say that we should talk more about conflict and think more about conflict when we focus on issues that are not directly related to conflict, well, one might say that it just goes back to the old conversation about conflict sensitivity and mainstreaming conflict sensitivity and so forth. So for example, that when discussing trade agreements or the introduction of new standards on the origin of products and so forth, we should be thinking a lot about conflict, because all of these have a number of possibly unintended consequences on conflict dynamics. And this is indeed part of EU thinking, as far as I understand, because it appears quite clearly, for example, in the EU-Georgia association agenda, even more than in the association agreements themselves. And yet the issue of contested borders remains very important when doing any agreements, as appears, I think, very clearly when we think about the whole debate on Brexit, where the Irish border is posing like, I mean, it is one issue, one contested but ultimately so far well-regulated border, and it is like posing potentially insurmountable issues in the whole negotiation process around Brexit. So, but what I want to claim is that if potential conflict-related issues are taken into considerations, there is actually room for a degree of flexibility, and we've seen that in a number of circumstances. Well, one example is like how the EU dealt with Transnistria, for example, in Moldova, with like, interim solutions and compromise solutions. And of course, like the conflicts in the Caucasus are very different. If we look outside of the region, for example, I think that another interesting example is how the EU dealt with like products coming from, let's say, the Israeli settlements in the Golan Heights, in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank. So back in 2005, there was like a clearly said statement coming from, well, first there was a decision of the Court of Justice, and then from the European Commission itself, clarifying that, for example, products coming from these regions, I mean, they still can be traded with the European Union, but they cannot, enjoy preferential treatment. And when clarifying the place of origin, it must be like clarify that it comes from Israeli settlements in these places. So this just goes back to the point that there are a range of solutions that can be, let's say, used and can be found even when having agreements that seem to be, quite defined. Like, there's a border and there's a rule, but there's always a number of ways to go around that, and there's different kind of solutions that can be found even in difficult conflict situations. So this is, we see all of this in the thinking of the EU in the region, and I think we don't see it so much in the talking. And I wonder if we should talk more openly about this kind of issues. And this is always a tough question, as talking openly about sensitive issues can lead to political backlash, as we've seen in the past. So there is some reason to make an argument that we should think more about conflict sensitivity and so forth, but talk less about it. And I see why that makes sense, but I wonder if this is really possible in a context where transparency is so important for building trust. And after all, even if it is difficult to have a public conversation about conflict-related matters, it is always difficult, but perhaps having it around pragmatic aspects, such as trade deals and such, would not be the worst place to start with. So I'll move on to the second part of my initial proposition, which is that we should talk less about conflict when dealing directly with conflict areas themselves. And I should clarify that I think this applies very well, let's say, to let's say, the conflict perhaps around Abkhazia, to some extent South Ossetia. I think not so much at this stage probably around the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, but I think I will mention that because in the medium term, I think it should be part of our thinking on how to approach that conflict as well. So again, this is part of the broader conversation on effective peace building and about not talking directly about conflict when working on confidence building. And there's a number of initiatives that run under confidence building program that of course should continue working in this direction, basically doing straightforward confidence building, and EPNK is one of these examples. It should absolutely continue along these lines. But in other contexts, and they've seen it is particularly in Abkhazia and also in Transnistria, a lot of the activities that were taking place under, let's say, nominally confidence building programs were mostly capacity building initiatives or development assistance or even livelihood programs. And this takes place, in different ways, for example, through COBRM in Georgia or through support to confidence building measures programs in Moldova. And this takes place very often through cooperation between the European Union and various UN agencies, in particular UNDP or other organizations working in the region. And I think this pragmatic approach of doing, let's say, capacity building or inclusive capacity building, if you want to call it that, is quite good, and that this approach, let's say, broadly speaking, which is very often promoted from the ground, let's say from officers working in this field, it should be welcomed, but also strengthened and institutionalized, since framing capacity building initiatives as confidence building sometimes contributes to defeat their nominal purpose, since very often authorities and people on different sides of borders or conflict have to somewhat second guess what confidence building means in their case. Is it good or bad for them? What does confidence building lead to? And I think it is impossible to run a program without having its participants question the motivations of the donors or everything, actually all actors involved. So from this point of view, having initiatives that specifically focus on capacity building and explicitly focus on that, I think may be less divisive and will not push recipients to second guess what it is all about. So if making more clear that the primary goal of such programs is what it says on the tin, so it's actually the welfare and rights of the people involved. And again, I think this helps building an environment of transparency and trust, and having a coherent narrative that can fit, that can be served well for all actors involved. So again, so if we can just have perhaps more of these initiatives, and of course mainstream to some extent, conflict sensitivity within them. And I think that we've seen some examples of these kind of actions, and they've seen it, for example, in some of the the MPARD program, for example, in Georgia, which is the Program for Agricultural and Rural Development, which part of its activities, for example, were taking place in Abkhazia, but without like being part of an explicitly called like confidence building strategy. Of course, they were part of confidence building, like broadly speaking, but they were not called such. And I think by not calling them such, they actually contributed to make them more effective in many ways. Just a very brief comment on the regional dimension, which is like one of the big issues we have to face is, so would it be possible to have initiatives such as MPARD at the regional level, let's say at the South Caucasus level? And we have like MPARD in Georgia, we have it in Armenia. Would it be possible to make it regional and make it as border blind as possible, if I may say so? Would this bring added value? And this is very much an open question. It's been very difficult. And even when the EU within its own, let's say, border with EU member states has tried to do, very often it has been like working with like sub-state entities and administrative entities and municipalities and so forth, and this has been quite effective. So I think that like having a regional dimension is always difficult, but if there is like one way to make it succeed, it should go like going local may be the best way to go regional after all. I finish on this.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. And on your last words there, they very much chime with my own approach working in the NGO sphere that the local is strategic, and that has to be a key focus of efforts. Moving straight on into the other end of the table now, if I may, Jamie Shea, and in terms of NATO perspective, another.
Well, Craig, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm always delighted after the first panel to see that for the second panel, there are still more people in the audience than actually on the panel. I've often been at conferences where that has not been the case. So first of all, let me congratulate you on your fortitude. I'm also absolutely delighted to be here today. I thought that the trains were going to frustrate me, but NATO always prevails in the end. Although, having said that, I have to point out that I'm not a NATO official any longer, but a former NATO official, now an academic. But I've been, I think, invited here not to give you any blinding academic insights, but really to talk a little bit about my policy role working with Georgia and to a lesser extent Armenia and Azerbaijan when I was a NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General until recently. Let me also say, just before I kick off, Craig, that I'm really very pleased to be here at St Antony's in a relaxed frame of mind, because my son many years ago did his MPhil here, and my abiding memory of this college is an exhausting drive over from Brussels at the beginning and the end of every term, and then absolutely ruining my spine, having to drag his suitcases and piles of books up and down the stairs. So, as Robert Graves would have said, goodbye to all that. I'm pleased to be here to look at the intellectual side rather than the physical side of the college. All right, well, when we look at the three key players from a NATO perspective in the South Caucasus, they're all very different, of course. We have, if you like, Georgia, which aspires to NATO membership and is very keen on that, notwithstanding all of the obstacles and the timetable that no doubt we'll talk about in the Q&A in just a moment. We have Armenia, which is in a unique situation of being really the only country in all of NATO's 41 partners which is both in the Central Security Treaty Organization, in the Eurasian Union, while also being a very active member of the Partnership for Peace. And therefore, although Armenia has no aspiration for NATO membership, nonetheless for NATO it's a very important country because it's really one of the few sort of linked countries in a dividing Europe that shows that you can have multiple identities. You can have close relations with Russia, notwithstanding this confrontational cycle that we're in at the moment after the Russian annexation of Crimea in March 2014, and yet still send troops to participate in NATO's operations in the Balkans. So if Armenia doesn't succeed in that balancing act, then we really do say goodbye to any notion of a single Europe, and we accept a return to a semi-permanent Cold War division. So even though the level of practical interaction may be much less than Georgia, Armenia is important. And Azerbaijan, I think, is an interesting case because it was a country that was very keen on NATO until 2014. But after also NATO somewhat mishandled its invitation to Georgia to join the alliance at the Bucharest Summit in 2008, by sort of saying, yes, darling, I promise to marry you, but let's not talk about any practical steps in that direction for the time being. You remember we said that Georgia would be a member of NATO one day, but then turned down granting Georgia a membership action plan, which would have been the practical NATO-agreed roadmap for Georgia to start going through the preparations to join NATO. So it was a little bit, I give you on the one hand, and I take it away on the other. And frankly, Russia did exploit that strategic ambiguity against both NATO and Georgia in August 2008. And I think after that, President Putin sort of telephoned Saakashvili and the other leaders of the region and said, look, you may not like me, but I say what I do and I do what I say. unlike those NATO people who make you false promises and don't really sort of follow them up in a crisis situation. So it essentially come back to me. And I think after 2008, at least we in NATO saw quite a major sort of if you like, direction of Azerbaijan. Not that it stopped talking to NATO, but ideas of an associate membership of NATO, which have been very prevalent in Baku up until that time. Ideas of having US bases in Azerbaijan, which had also been mentioned, suddenly disappeared. And I think rather like Armenia, from a NATO perspective, Azerbaijan took a much more sort of distant and more balanced approach. So much of the debate has focused inevitably on Georgia, given the degree of engagement and its membership aspirations. Where are we? Well, Georgia does have a very, very close relationship with NATO. It's one of 5, therefore very rare, very privileged, enhanced opportunity partners. It has a NATO-Georgia Commission, which meets regularly at Foreign Minister, Defence Minister, ambassadorial level, where Georgia can raise its concerns with the 29 allies present around the table. We have 2 very ambitious annual plans to integrate Georgia into NATO structures and to achieve interoperability of armed forces and military reform, a structured NATO-Georgia program, as well as an annual national plan. We have a liaison office in Tbilisi, military civilian, which does public diplomacy, but also advises the Ministry of Defence. And something which I think I found when I visited it a couple of months ago, very impressive, is a joint technical and evaluation centre just outside Tbilisi, heavily staffed by the United States military, and which is really helping the Georgian army with day-to-day exercising and day-to-day training. And that's interesting because the impression I got when I was out there at the Joint Training and Evaluation Centre was that Georgia is sort of trying to answer the question, well, we can't belong to NATO because you think that we cannot be defended. Look at what happened in 2008. Russia could very easily, even with an armed force which was far less modern and far less proficient than the Russian forces that we see today in Crimea, but even in 2008, we couldn't resist for very long. But if we were able, with Western help, to develop a kind of hedgehog strategy of being very prickly and therefore very difficult to pick up and very difficult to occupy. Inspired by the experience of Ukraine in World War II, inspired by the experience of the Baltic states, the idea of popular sort of resistance, mass mobilization, having an army much more geared to territorial defense that could frustrate Russia, make life very difficult, then maybe we're not so undefendable after all. So there's a lot of interesting thinking going on in the Georgian armed forces about what kind of concept might make membership more attractive to NATO, in the sense that Georgia could be effectively defended. It would not be an isolated sort of West Berlin as we had during the Cold War. And therefore the day-to-day interaction is major. Georgia is the largest non-NATO contributor to Afghanistan consistently, both in ISAF and the current Resolute Support Mission, which has also suffered a significant number of casualties. And we have cooperation across the board. For example, when I was in Tbilisi, I was looking at cyber defense, where we are helping Georgia with a national cyber defense plan and to set up its National Cyber Security Centre with a high degree of intelligence sharing. Georgia would like to follow Finland and be the second partner country to sign a memorandum of understanding with NATO on cyber defence. I was looking at women, peace and security and launching a programme to help the Georgian Armed Forces to mainstream gender better because they, if you know Georgia, many of you here do of course, they are fantastic at employing women in the civil service and the diplomatic corps, very impressive indeed, less so in the armed forces. What a waste of talent. So we have a programme to try to help the Georgians to remedy that. And we were looking at helping Georgia also in the hybrid warfare category. As you know, in Brussels today, both in NATO and the EU, the buzzword is resilience. We're all into how do we combat fake news, how do we harden our information technology against cyber attacks, how do we protect our critical infrastructure, how do we have better situational awareness of hybrid campaigns. Georgia, of course, has suffered a lot of these prior and post 2008. So, like Ukraine, we have lots of experience to share in terms of building this resilience. And of course, this was mentioned already by Amanda, the fact that the Black Sea has become so much more significant in our strategic calculus post-Crimea, because that's an area where both NATO forces are operating much more frequently and Russian forces are operating. And we have a big issue in NATO at the moment, which is the militarization of the Crimea Peninsula, the issue of the Ukrainians barred from accessing the Sea of Azov, particularly in terms of ships being held up or turned back. We also, of course, have the modernization by Russia of the old Russia-Ukrainian Black Sea Fleet. As that becomes, frankly, a more contested, I won't use the word confrontational, but contested area, the Georgians recognize that their real estate is very important for NATO, and the Georgians have come up with 6 initiatives to cooperate more with us with Black Sea, situational awareness, intelligence sharing, use of ports and facilities, for example, and Georgian participation in the standing NATO groups and forces that we are modernizing to have a more on-call capability in that area. This is also assisted by the fact that in the other side of the Black Sea, in Romania in particular, lesser extent in Bulgaria, NATO now has a much more tailored forward presence with exercises, with a significant increase in air presence, and a brigade headquarters for rotational deployments hosted by Romania. So the Black Sea has become an area where clearly Georgia can see that it can integrate even more into NATO, as it's been doing, for example, by offering forces to the NATO response force. So where are we on the membership issue? Well, there are a number of problems, of course, here. The first is this vexed issue, which we haven't managed to resolve, which is, does Georgia require a membership action plan, like, the engagement before you get married, the MPhil before you can go on and do a DPhil, if I can use Oxford terminology, or can it just go straight to the marriage or the DPhil without the MPhil? Georgia argues that because it's been a part of NATO for so many years and has these very advanced programs, it's basically done the map without being in the map, and therefore it should be given sort of credit for that, and we can start accession talks on the basis of an invitation without going through that very protracted period, for example, which kept Macedonia, or North Macedonia, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, in a partnership without membership for the best part of 16 years. Unfortunately for the Georgians, the Germans, the French, the Dutch, the Italians, those countries which in NATO tend to be much more reluctant to engage in future rounds of enlargement, particularly in the post-Soviet space, also, of course, think Ukraine, albeit allowing in a more benign way, countries in the Balkans, like Montenegro and Macedonia, to join NATO. Those countries really still insist on the map and therefore the Bucharest decision. And therefore the Georgians are a bit stuck there for the time being. The second issue is the issue of hostage taking. And I want to tell you, if you just, Craig, indulge me with 1 minute, but I think it will interest the audience. I want to give you a sense of what power politics actually means. Before the NATO Summit, you remember in July when President Trump graced us with his presence at NATO headquarters, we were essentially sort of thinking, let's have a summit with Georgia. We're not ready to solve the map issue, but we need to give the Georgians a sign, a signal that we appreciate the efforts in Afghanistan, in the Black Sea that they've made on our behalf. So let's have a summit with Georgia. Yeah, okay, fine. That's good. And the Georgians would have been happy with that. Also tweak the communique language, make it sound a bit sexier, a bit more positive, to show that, at least in terms of the intensity of words, we're moving forward. But then the Canadians and some other allies spoke up and said, aha! But what about a nuke, a NATO-Ukraine commission? because we also have a NATO Ukraine Commission. We also have an enlargement promise also given in Bucharest in 2008 to Ukraine. So, you can't have one without the other, right? Can't give a candy to your brother without giving a candy to your sister. But then the Hungarians spoke up and said, but we won't agree to a nuke because we have an issue with the Ukrainians over Hungarian minority language in schools, and therefore, no nuke, no NGC, NATO Georgia Commission. So, okay, nobody particularly happy, and the compromise, because there's always a compromise in diplomacy, we'll have a meeting on the Black Sea with the Ukrainians and the Georgians, so they'll have a role in the summit, their leaders will come to Brussels, but it won't be an individual nuke or NGC. All right? On that morning, the second day of the summit, you're going to love this, folks, just bear with me. On the day of the summit, we start the meeting at 10 o'clock in the morning, no Trump. Where is he? Okay, let's go, can't wait. Maybe he's having breakfast. So we're about 20 minutes into the meeting with Georgia, Ukraine, when suddenly Trump arrives and sits down and he doesn't realise that he's in a Georgia-Ukraine meeting. He believes he's in a NATO meeting with just NATO. So he starts going on about burden sharing. I want the Allies to pay 2% by Christmas, or maybe the US. You laugh, but I was there. This happened. And he says, I want 2% by Christmas, and everybody thinks, my God, this is for NATO. So Angela Merkel gets up, goes over to Stoltenberg, who NATO Secretary General is chairing, and essentially says, Jens, we've got to stop this meeting. So the meeting stopped. Ukraine and Georgia have to leave, and then we have a NATO meeting on 2%, the timetable. Will the US really link that with maintaining its commitments to NATO? And so, having haggled for several weeks to finally find this format, within 15 minutes it had gone. Why do I tell you this? Not to make you laugh, because this is not a laughing matter, but I just want to give you a sense of how these issues, which are of key importance for Ukraine or Georgia, regionally and individually, can suddenly get caught up in some massive sort of transatlantic hostage taking, and unfortunately there's always that danger. The final thing I will say is that one thing that is important is what can we do with Georgia, like our other partners, if the membership track, which was the automatic sort of finality, is not available? Should we support sort of regional Black Sea type frameworks? Or, going back to Guam, you remember the Georgia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Moldova framework. Would Turkey, a question for Amanda, be interested as sort of security substitutes, like the Nordics have their sort of frameworks there, or Visegrad, or elsewhere in Europe? What can we do? Do we need a regional group, which we don't have for the region, but we do have, for example, for North Africa or the Middle East? What other ways are there? And I'll finish by saying, when I was actually in Tbilisi, everybody was very happy because an American academic, some of you may know, Rafi Gregorian, had just come out in the US think tank world with a paper sort of suggesting that NATO could enlarge to Georgia, but omitting South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Because these are Russian-occupied provinces, it would be very difficult to give them a NATO security guarantee. You know what that would mean. And then there was a big debate, well, does that sort of divide Georgia? Does that sort of legitimize Abkhazia or South Ossetia as independent states? Would we be doing Ukraine a favour by taking half in now and maybe the other half later on? Could NATO only defend part but not all of the territory? And so on. And maybe that's not the right solution. But what the Georgians were really delighted about with Rafi's article was at least there was a sense that at least we're discussing it again, rather than this endless paralysis of, I want to marry you but I can't marry you. We want to move forward but we can't move forward. We're in a kind of endless no man's land, finding gimmicks, to keep doing other things to show that we're making progress. At least we're now sort of looking under what circumstances might it be feasible for Georgia to join NATO, and then having defined those circumstances, how do you work your way backwards to the present to define a roadmap for how to get there? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And I think you've reminded us of, the differentiated landscape out there, but also the possibilities for some regional initiatives. I think useful that you were actually finding time to mention the Ukraine context, and of course we've all seen what that's been part and parcel of in terms of the geopolitics, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years. But I think it's something maybe for the discussion to come back when we're looking at this region and the wider context. Is it a case of finding a balance between not overstating the Ukraine effects, but certainly also not underestimating them, whether it's with regard to the conflict situations and political attention and so forth. But thank you also for your insights and reminder about the Trump factor. And winding up, Armenak, if you'd like to.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here in this magical town. Thanks for Links and Dennis for that. And let me join you in complimenting our audience, because no one has left while we were talking. So I think that's also another factor that we have wonderful audience here. And the other thing that I want to mention, I'm a crisis group analyst, but I work in the Middle East department, not in the Caucasus department. So the views are solely mine. I'm here with my personal capacity, but I do follow the region, and I've recently moved to, I can say that for the past 2.5 years, I've been living in the Caucasus. So I'm rather familiar with the situation. And when I was asked to talk here, I came up with a question that I've been asking myself, which is there has been a major and important change in Armenia, and out of that change there is, of course, there is hope, but there's also uncertainty, and the uncertainty extends to the foreign policy as well. So when we have official Yerevan, there is uncertainty in terms of foreign policy in official Yerevan. How do important and relevant international actors see that? So I will try to answer this question, and of course we can have a debate after that. I'm just coming from Yerevan, and I can tell that there are many feelings, and two of those are hope and uncertainty. When it comes to hope, I think there should be hope, and it is legitimate, because this tiny country in the Caucasus, which often appears on the map or in the media when there are some unfortunate incidents on Nagorno-Karabakh front, has caught the region by surprise by doing something that I think no analyst predicted. Peaceful protests, big numbers of people on the street, and at least I haven't seen any major violent incidents during the peaceful protests. So I think there was a genuine non-violent resistance, so we have to give the credit to the Armenian population for that. But also, to a certain extent, there was a peaceful, there was a will from the acting leadership back then to give up on power, which is something we don't often see these days, especially in the Middle East, where I travel a lot. So I think that's an achievement that we should recognize. And also we do see the repercussions. I mean, as far as I see, the changes in Armenia have had their influence on Georgia, and I think on the long term they will have their influence on Azerbaijan as well. But of course, there is uncertainty in Yerevan, and I think that's normal. There's a new leadership, there's new elite coming to power, and it hasn't yet consolidated power. So this uncertainty is very much normal. But when it comes to foreign policy, I think actors, specifically Brussels, European Union, Moscow, Russia, and Tehran, they would want to see clearer policy line from Yerevan. And So as I said, the new leadership is putting a new political agenda, and they have mentioned that they are not going to change their foreign policy radically. But I still think that there isn't enough predictability for those actors to understand the Armenian foreign policy. So to take crisis group approach, like if I were to recommend the Armenian government, I would say that there is still time, of course, but slowly and surely they have to clearly define their interests when it comes to foreign policy and not remain uncertain and unpredictable. That is one. And second, when it comes to announcements that we haven't changed our policy or we will not change our policy, I think these capitals, the major international actors, they will take that seriously once you have once the new elite consolidates power and shows rather than talks about this their agenda of not changing foreign policy. And so this is on the one hand. On the other hand, if I were to advise the Russian, European, and Iranian leadership, my advice would be that we do see uncertainty and unpredictability to a certain extent in Armenia, but this doesn't necessarily mean hostility or change in policy. This means that there has been a major and meaningful and surprising change inside the country. So the domestic politics have changed, and we need to give some time. So there needs to be patience in these major capitals. There needs to be patience and give some time until the Armenian leadership is able to redefine or reassert its foreign policy. So again, uncertainty does not mean hostility or necessarily a change in the political orientation. Okay, my final point is about Azerbaijan, and so as far as I can see. The Azerbaijani leadership, I mean, thankfully there haven't been any major escalation on the border, which some analysts predicted that changes in Yerevan could give the opportunity for clashes on the border, and thankfully that hasn't happened yet. But as far as I can see, Azerbaijan is trying to use this relative weakness in Armenia to enhance its own interest in international forums or regional context or international context. I mean, I'm not surprised states, pursue their interest as they define or as their leadership defines. But there are lessons that Azerbaijan has to also reap from the Armenian experience, and that is that there is a wind of change in the region. And I'm a little bit surprised how this issue has been overlooked, but perhaps I've been dealing with Middle East and North Africa and with lots of social movements, protests, and significant change, also destruction of countries. So I would say that this change and the appetite of social movement is in the region, and this should be a sign for the Azerbaijani government that there are needed reforms and inside the country, and taking for granted that a strong country based on security or a high revenue is not a guarantee of long-term stability. So despite the hostility between these two countries, I think there are lessons for the entire region to learn from the Armenian experience. And we've seen in the Middle East how extremely powerful securitized countries fall within weeks or get destroyed for decades to come in the case of Syria. Yeah, so I end there.
Thank you. I want to thank you very much, and also for keeping your comments concise there. I think, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you for your patience and attention. We, I think, have had 4 very substantive and full presentations there. With the organisers and hosts agreement, maybe if we could base on 15 to 20 minutes of questions, but of course I don't want to hold people back from lunch, and I know there's also a time schedule there. I suppose in terms of the last comments, and aware of the makeup of this panel, if there was anyone in the audience who wanted to come back, in particular in terms of perspective from Baku on recent developments, I think that would be very, very useful. With a panel like this, it has to be selective, and in a way that 2 of the elephants, apart from Oliphant here, but two of the elephants that didn't get so much attention were really Russia, I think, and in a way Iran. So again, with anyone making or putting questions, but if you want to put some brief comments on that, I think it would also be useful for the fuller discussion. Already 2 people have caught my eye, so Mayor Zal, thank you. And I think we'll cluster a few comments and input.
Thank you. Actually, I would like to first to ask us practical examples that are that you see the Azerbaijan government is using this opportunity, what's happening in Armenia. So that will be helpful to understand what you mean, because otherwise we can speculate a lot of things. But I would like to say the perspective is from Baku about this issue. I mean, there was a full non-intervention policy since what happened in Armenia since the April. It's not only related to the escalation, not having an escalation in the line of contact. Also, it was also the government officials keep very silent about this, the commenting on the situation in Armenia. But let's say, I mean, this tolerance was until this May or June, because of this when Armenian government in many respects start making a lot of statements related to Nagorno-Karabakh, which this statement is not accepted for not only the government of Aliyev, also the opposition, also the majority of Azerbaijanis. So I mean, unification of the Nagorno-Karabakh is, I mean, this is something that is not not a case for in Azerbaijan. All regarding the 7 occupied territories as a part of the Nagorno-Karabakh is also not acceptable. So this kind of thing is not only when we discuss this, the government, okay, nature of the government, let's say, put like this, and also when Nagorno-Karabakh, I mean, this is the 2 different things. Nature of government is, I mean, very clear to everyone. But also, but when it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh, I mean, Nagorno-Karabakh issue is also there is no diverse opinion about the society about this when it comes to that. Oh, that's why. What if you mean that statements or using opportunity as Azerbaijan is declaring that the current statement is not helpful for resolution? Yes, this is the the majority opinion. It's
Not helpful for what?
If what you say that Azerbaijan is using opportunity is declaring that okay, Azerbaijan is not. Azerbaijan is asking the withdrawal of Armenian troops from Nagorno-Karabakh, this kind of things, but I don't see a new declaration or using this, let's say, international forum. So this is a brief, the reflection is from Baku, but I think that most of the government has different opinion, but I don't see any government, let's say, officials here to reflect.
So, thank you very much. Obviously, the next panel session will focus more closely on the conflicts, and we'll come back to that. If I may park that for now, and if anyone from the audience wants to come in at all on the regional dimension or any points of disagreement at all or clarification. Neil.
Thanks, Greg. I guess probably for Jamie. I mean, what do you, many people think that Russia, to take the regional dimension, is simply unwilling to accept a significant security presence of Western institutions in the Caucasus. If that is so, and this is the question for Jamie, is NATO for Georgia a solution to its regional systemic security problem, or a solution?
Right, if we could perhaps give a chance, and maybe starting in reverse order almost, and Jamie has a question to you first of all.
Well, I think sincerely, I think it's an excellent question. I think that the starting point is Georgia is a democracy, not a perfect one, as we've seen from the recent presidential elections and some of the campaign rhetoric. But it's a democracy. It's a country that wants to join NATO. NATO has been loyal, if you like, to its commitment that it made back in the 1990s to be open to countries that want to join. Even if, of course, that is not going to be an automatic process. I don't think anybody sees that our strategic situation is going to be easier by not having Georgia as that sort of island, whatever you want to call it, without any disrespect to Armenia or Azerbaijan, but of sort of Western support in the area. The sense is that if Georgia comes back into a Russian sphere of influence, Russia probably will pursue competition with NATO in just the same way. So there's a loss in terms of the Georgians, but no particular strategic gain by doing a Yalta and saying, okay, you be nice to us and you stop all those exercises and remove your ships from the Black Sea and you evacuate Crimea and we'll accept that. Russians have given no indication that they would ever keep their part of the bargain, if you like, if we did that. And I suppose, therefore, what we're trying to do is to make Georgia more difficult to invade through that type of development of the defence concept that I outlined. So it would come at a greater cost than in 2008 as far as NATO is concerned. But on the other hand, also, and this is the difficult balancing act, try to persuade the Georgians in a way that the Armenians have been able to do, to try to sort of normalise their relations with Russia. Because of course for many countries, let's take the Dutch or the Germans, Georgia, which has good relations with Russia, is an easier candidate for NATO membership, less risk, than a Georgia which doesn't, which has bad relations with Russia, and then you're almost committed to go to war 3 or 4 days later to defend it. But then, of course, the paradox of that situation is that if you have good relations with Russia, the Georgian need for defence goes down, so the need for NATO membership goes down. So how far do you sort of balance that, as you rightly say, protect you from Russia, but on the other hand, don't take that as meaning that you can do what Saakashvili did in 2008 and act in a hot-headed way. You also, like the Baltic states with their border demarcation, or Poland after it became independent, you also have an obligation to get on with Russia. And so I suppose one good question, which we didn't discuss, and I think the panel can take it up at the audience, is, what is Russia's game here? Is it to sort of try to destabilise Georgia, like it has done by occupying Ossetia and South Abkhazia, to make it a less attractive proposition for NATO by keeping it sort of permanently destabilised? Or is it to launch a charm offensive? For example, we know that Mr. Ivanishvili didn't get all of his billions just from Georgia. The Georgians have a large migrant population, as we know, working in Russia. Their wine, their water and agricultural products have to be exported to Russia. There have been signs lately, some opinion polls, again I invite other people to comment on this, that maybe Georgian perceptions have been warming up to Russia. There's been not a normalisation, but at least through the church and other areas, an approximation. So how does this play out over time? Does Georgia sort of stay as a kind of, West Berlin siege mentality in the hope that eventually NATO will come to its rescue, or because this thing sort of like in Macedonia drags on year after year, the population become a little bit tired, maybe like Turkey with EU membership, a bit frustrated with the whole thing, and say, oh well, maybe living with our neighbours of Russia in the region is not so bad after all, and that sort of, NATO's never going to say yes to us, and so that's we need to sort of, like Azerbaijan I mentioned after 2008, sort of reorient ourselves in a more realistic world, and take NATO's dilemma away from it, if you like, by saying, well, we're not really seeking membership any longer. I think it depends again, with Russia, whether you use the carrot or the stick.
Thank you, Jamie. Did anyone else on the panel want to come back specifically to Neil's question? And if not, just to give Armenia a chance, because I didn't want to close that down, but
Yeah, sure.
if you wanted to come back on some points particularly,
Thanks for the comment. 3 points. First, about that there are no new policies. Particularly, I actually agree on that. As I see, there has been an established policy of Azerbaijan to isolate Armenia from the region, and I think that is, in that sense, it hasn't really changed. That first. The second, you asked for an evidence, and I actually have two. One is my observation. The recent Turkey, Iran and Azerbaijan meeting and the memorandum that they signed, I think this is a this is a good example of how in the past few months Azerbaijan has been working actively on its policy, and I don't know how is the view from Baku, but it could be seen as an achievement to be able to sign this memorandum with Tehran. And finally, a second hand, I was reading our crisis group analysis on the recent events, and one point they made, as far as I remember, was a very good point, welcoming the fact that Azerbaijan didn't use this opportunity, as you said, didn't use the opportunity of internal instability in Armenia to launch a military offensive, and this is a fact. We haven't seen anything. But at the same time, the piece was saying that instead of using a military means, they have been using more of a diplomatic soft channels to further isolate Armenia from the region. And again, you're the expert in our organization, not me. I could be wrong, but this is how I see the picture.
Yes, please, Roy.
Thank you. Craig, you mentioned in your introductory comments the visit by John Bolton around. My question is whether the panel feels that what is now sort of deepening antagonism between the United States and Iran, given teeth by US sanctions, can the states of the region dissociate themselves sufficiently from this so that it doesn't become another source of division between the countries in the region? I note in this context that when John Bolton went to Yerevan and met Pashinyan, he was told quite bluntly that in fact Armenia would not be following sanctions requests against Iran, and that Iran was a good trade partner. But these kind of requests and with the risk of being drawn into these wider conflicts around are a difficulty for a region that seeks to insulate itself from that. It has pressures which relate to events within the region directly enough as it is, without additional global antagonisms drawing the countries apart.
Thank you, Roy. And keeping a wary eye on the watch, and also your lunches, I wondered if I could invite different members of the panel to come back, maybe specifically on that sort of John Bolton question and different perspectives you might have picked up, whether travelling or being based in the region. The other thing, just because it was mentioned by Almanak just now, if you wanted to say a little bit more, Amanda, about the Turkey-Iran-Azerbaijan memorandum. I know you referred to it in your talk, but if there was anything further you wanted to add, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't honestly think there's that much more to add on that, because it's just a memorandum, but I mean, it's another example of Turkey trying to, let's say, extend its economic ties and influence beyond the South Caucasus, into Iran, and it's something that's seen very important. And of course, Iran isn't the only country where Turkey is hoping to develop, these new trade and transport links, because in Turkey, there's a large hope as well that the Silk Road, the famous, One Belt and One Road Chinese initiative, will also be shortly passing through the Caucasus and coming to Turkey. All these initiatives, whether it's Iran, China, or what other country, they're all aimed at, strengthening Turkey's regional role and turning Turkey into this much sought after position as a hub of transport, communication, everything, to give it much more regional outreach. And I just want to comment on this issue of John Bolton, because I was actually in Yerevan when John Bolton was there a couple of weeks ago, and I would agree that Pashinyan very strongly pushed back against the idea that Armenia could in any way reduce the relationship that it has with Iran, because this relationship is crucially important to Armenia, and if anything, Armenia wants to increase its relationship with Iran, not reduce it. And I think the same answer was given more or less to John Bolton in Baku as well. He was basically told by the foreign minister, I think actually the Azerbaijani foreign minister gave him a good few lessons in actually how he should be dealing with Iran. And honestly, I find the whole thing of the Americans going around the world basically telling everybody they need to reduce their relations with Iran, they need to follow the sanctions regime, as it just goes way too far. And particularly now within the context of what's happened with Saudi Arabia and this, killing of this chap in the consulate in Istanbul of Jamal, which has basically already disappeared from the headlines. But again, this is all focused on isolating Iran in the region, which I don't think is a very credible policy. But also, it's quite interesting that that those that have been given sanction waivers there's a lot of them, and it's 6 months. What's going to happen after that actually remains to be seen. So I think there probably is some flexibility in both Azerbaijan and Armenia from the American perspective on the Iranian issue. I'm sure they both made, let's say, a trade-off on something else. And if I could just comment actually on the issue of Russia. I personally think, that the Russians want to keep Georgia as weak for as long as they possibly can, because as James Sher always says, stability in the Northern Caucasus depends on Russia maintaining a strong influence in the Southern Caucasus. So the two things go together, and for the Russians to be able to maintain this strong influence in the Southern Caucasus, or have any influence, it's to a large part dependent on them being able to keep the countries, weak and dependent in different aspects from Russian side. And I do believe, Georgian ambassador will probably correct me. Georgia has had some dialogue with Russia, particularly in terms of strengthening trade relations. And of course, it would be very good if Georgia could have good relations with Russia. But of course, Georgia's a sovereign state. It can't be, one party bossing the other, or a party around, which is the actual habit of Russia, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. Gilbert, you're happy? Yeah.
I could say something, just sorry to come back in, but I could say something very briefly on the US angle. I think that what you see in Georgia, like you do in Poland today with the idea of a Fort Trump, an American sort of permanent military base in Poland, which the Poles have offered to pay $2 billion a year to have. what I think you see is that obviously NATO membership is the goal, but in the meantime, the closer you can get to the United States and the more US military help you get, then that's almost as good type of thing, because obviously the US is NATO, right? And that the US guarantee is the key thing. And the United States has been very active. When I was in Tbilisi, the US had just sent extra personnel at this joint training center. They had given Javelin missiles, anti-tank missiles to Georgia, which I think for the Georgians was an enormous stride forward, particularly in this sort of territorial defense concept that I was talking about. And that was a reflection of the fact that the Trump administration had decided to give Ukraine a package of lethal weapons, whereas the Obama administration had kept this very much to non-lethal weapons. So to some degree, the more the United States is helping Ukrainian forces, the more there is a sense, well, if we're doing it for Kiev, we can give 10% of these to Tbilisi at the same time. And so the American sort of engagement with people like Kurt Volker and so on in the Ukraine, I think, is helping the Georgians. The US Navy is very keen, has carried out joint military exercises, both within NATO but also bilateral in the Black Sea with the Georgians, the port visits, the recognised air picture. In other words, the Georgians are being integrated into the recognised radar situational awareness of NATO over the Black Sea. Of course, coming back to Russia, the closer the Georgians come to the US militarily, that maybe provides some security, but again, it also puts them more in the crosshairs. So there's always going to be a trade-off here. The final point I'd make to Roy's very good question, I can't answer it on Iran, which I know was the focus, but at least on Georgia, US, is that this has been very much driven by Jim Mattis, the adults, as we used to call them, although there are not many left any longer, member of the administration who, to some degree, sort of came out of that traditional Republican internationalist or mode, of being in favour of NATO enlargement, supportive of the new democracies of the East. And if they, speculation in the US press at the moment, if Jim Mattis will stay on, but if a lot of these people do go, will that sort of sense of supporting democracy in the East, will that be as strong with a President Trump and more like-minded people around him?
Thank you very much, Jamie. And very finally, you're happy, yeah. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention and patience. Any errors of timekeeping on my own, even though we did start a little bit late. But I also just wanted to thank Commander for the reference to One Belt, One Road, because that's another kind of whole new discussion as well in terms of China's role, and certainly my own disrespectful ways of referring to that in the past are well overtaken by events. It's not all belt and no trousers. It is a growing reality in terms of infrastructure, and I'm sure at another time, and I know last time we had a conference, we were looking at the China thing. So thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch, and we look forward to be back here at about 2:15. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.